Okay, we are going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ashley Ferraro. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Global Learning at FDU. And welcome to today's UN NGO Pathway Forum. Today, we have the honor of having Ms. Dominique Day join us. And here is some background about Ms. Day. Ms. Day is the chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, a fact-finding body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate and report on the situation of African descent globally. She is a human rights attorney who also leads Daylight, Rule of Law, Access to Justice, Advocacy, and Access to Justice Platform for intersectional racial justice, and an accelerator for anti-racist practices in operation. Internationally, her policy and capacity building work focuses heavily on racial justice. She has an extensive criminal and civil litigation experience on behalf of individuals and communities within the Black diaspora, including in post-conflict and transitional states. She holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a Juris Doctor from Stanford Law School. And again, Ms. Day, thank you for joining us today. I would now like to hand the event over to the forum mediator, Diana Sviton.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley. And thank you, Ms. Day, for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to have you. And it's great to see everyone here. We have a great turnout this afternoon. So to get us started, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your professional path and how you came to work with the United Nations.
Yeah. So I've been practicing law for about 21 years now, a little bit more than something like this. And most of it's been focused heavily on racial justice. And at some point, I started working more and more internationally. The UN has these spaces that are under-resourced and underpaid and unpaid, actually, to be super honest, that look at the way either specific places or specific themes impact human rights. And racial justice is one of those, but also specifically anti-Black racism is one of those, because that had been an interest of mine and had been a focus of mine in my legal practice, in my policy work, and in my advocacy. It felt like a natural fit. And so at some point, I was able to join this work. I was appointed by the Human Rights Council to join this working group where I sit now. And I'm the person who is appointed from what they call the Western Europe and other states. And so the UN is divided into these 5 regions. Western Europe and other includes the US. It actually includes virtually every former colonizer. It's a weird category. And the other ones are vaguely geographical, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, Africa, like Asia Pacific, Africa. I'm of course forgetting something, Eastern Europe.
Okay, great. So you mentioned this term working group. What is a working group and what is its work?
Yeah. It's a great question. The UN, I think, as you all know, is the largest bureaucracy in the world. And if you know anything about bureaucracies, that's typically not a compliment. But what it does in order to navigate just the diplomatic and the negotiations of various interests of member states is to try to inform the conversations with facts, with information. And so there's something called the special procedures, which are fact-finding experts. So it's independent experts, working groups, special rapporteurs. Any of those terms that you tend to hear in UN spaces is part of this big umbrella group called the special procedures, which are a group of independent experts appointed and mandated by the Human Rights Council to in some way do fact finding and then report back. So most working groups have at least 5 members, 1 from each geographical region. Some do actually have more than that. To my knowledge, And all it means is instead of having one independent expert, for example, there's a special rapporteur on racism. That's one person who handles that whole mandate, or a special rapporteur on the situation in Myanmar, for example, right? That's one person. We have a working group that looks globally at the situation of people of African descent. It's 5 independent experts appointed, and then you have a specific term. So the president of the Human Rights Council appoints each individual person in kind of a staggered way. And then I sit on this working group for a 6-year period. But it's really just the way in which they've organized this issue. So to be honest, and this also is a big issue inside the UN spaces, there's also a debate about whether there are too many mandates. There's something like 75 or 78 different mandates right now, and it's on anything you can think of. If you can think of a problem, there's probably a mandate. There's one on housing, there's one on water, there's one on free expression. And so ours has to do with the situation of people of African descent, and looking largely at the context of transnational realities, often grounded in the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans, colonialism, these historical legacies that make anti-Black racism look a little different from other kinds of racism.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a whole range of mandates and the particular mandate for your working group. When was it originated, and what were the initial drivers to creating this this working group? Was there a special mandate or something that drove that mandate?
No, it's a great question, and a lot of people don't know, and a lot of Americans don't know. But basically, there was what's called the World Conference on Racism. It was the 3rd World Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa, in 2001. And the timing was maybe a little unfortunate because the conference ended and the resolutions were adopted just days before 9/11. And so a very exciting negotiation of what it looks like to really confront systemic racism using language of intersectionality, language of that comports with the racism that we understand it today, not so much the racism of, you know, my parents in the 60s, that maybe seemed a lot more connected to just pure legal reform. So in Durban, this conference happened, the World Conference on Racism happened, and both the Durban Declaration and the Durban Program of Action were adopted in that space. And that's sort of in the UN space, in these bureaucratic spaces, any event that happens, if it's important, it typically ends with a declaration or a resolution. And that language can be used to both create funding and to create vehicles to pursue justice. One of the vehicles created in the Durban conference, the conference on racism, was our mandate, this working group of experts on people of African descent. The special rapporteur on racism already existed and was also given additional duties. And there's some other bodies as well. But for us, our work, our mandate, and our legitimacy, right, the ways that we think about how we walk in the world have a lot to do with this document called the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which was adopted by acclamation by the member states, and then later on faced some political pushback from some of the powerful Western states, including the United States. But that, you know, if you ever see me in like a UN space, you'll see me always pulling language and pulling principles from Durban because it's a really robust document. If any of you guys love reading UN resolutions with your morning coffee, this is a good one to read. It's well drafted, it's thoughtful, and it's a nice jumping point. It's not as dry. I mean, I realize I'm smiling right now, but it's not as dry as that sounds. It's interesting.
So some good reading material there. Hopefully that will be really.
Yeah, maybe I can throw it in the chat actually, just
Okay.
to like give you a little incentive.
That's great. Now, you know, forming that declaration, I imagine was a huge challenge, particularly when we think of racism, right? And I wanted to get your perspective on how that was viewed in context. Was there, you know, a universal view or perspective on racism, or did they find that it was much more context specific? And you know, that kind of informs some of the challenges of addressing at a you know, multilateral level. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a challenge that we see, and I think we see this in the US even more because you know, we keep data. We have a very large Black population, and we've had a very public reckoning with the legalized racism of our past and the legalized racism of our present. So in the US, I think you'll find some of these conversations have been far more public, have been far more rigorous than in some other spaces. But I think this exact challenge that we talk about around how do we think about racism, how do we define racism, is answered, you know, as many different ways as there are member states. And so one of the things I try to do is really uplift some of the commonalities that exist state to state. The idea that, you know, I think you guys know this, race is a social construct. It's a political construct. It's not biological. If you look at my DNA and all of our DNAs together, you may struggle to figure out who among us is Black versus white versus something else, unless, in fact, we've been in in a geographic environment that is solely characterized by people of a specific, you know, demographic. And so because of that, sort of students of history understand that our construct of race came along to create and justify business necessity, right? When you're trafficking Black people across the ocean in order to create a pool of enslaved labor to act as machines, right? Sugar was not, I don't know if you guys have like read through some of the 1619 projects, right? Sugar was not a commercial product until you had a massive group of people who could be worked to death every 5 years in order to grow, protect, harvest, and mill it, right? So on some level, this space of both colonialism and the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans was also the driver of the systemic racism that we still grapple with today, and also the driver of these ideas of like things like white supremacy, right? To justify atrocities, you need to both deny some people their humanity and elevate other people's rationales, even if they feel very inhumane. So we spent a lot of time really saying, okay, here's an example of white supremacy in this particular context. Here's an example of anti-Black racism in this particular context. But even though this is a less developed country, even though this country's in Latin America, it looks very similar to the ways that we see anti-Black racism in the US or the ways we see it in Europe. And so I spent a lot of time in my work trying to draw lines because I think, as you suggest, Diana, there is a real, you know, it's not just Americans who buy into this idea of exceptionalism. There is a real urge to see things in these very concrete, discrete, non-connected ways. And yet, when I go country to country on country visits, which is one of the things we do in this working group, we visit different countries to investigate the situation of people of African descent, I hear very similar stories, even in very different countries. So that's a little mind-blowing for me, but it also tells you how much of our modern global economy and our transnational networks that really structure our lives today, look at the flight paths of British Airways, how much of that is really grounded in a historical legacy centered around both white supremacy and anti-Black racism.
Yeah. That's real, you know, your highlighting of kind of the business case and the driver for our historical legacy. And you also mentioned American exceptionalism. I wonder how in your country to country visits and in your work with many others from around the world, what are their perspectives of the US and the historical legacy that's there and what we're grappling with now? How do they view our challenges, and does our historical legacy put the US in a more difficult position when it's advocating for human rights or anti-racism elsewhere in the world?
You know, I wish I had a simple answer to that. I'll tell you this. Our history is obviously filled with atrocity, and so are the histories of a lot of other countries. But interestingly, when I talk to people of African descent in Europe, for example, I say to them, how do you deal with this? This is, you know, really bad things are happening. And they say to me, oh, especially young people, like university students, well, we feel like it's so much worse in the US. In the US, you're dying for your skin color. You're dying over race. And there's a perception, or there's a perception in the US that sometimes the racism is actually a lot worse in other spaces. There's a perception in other spaces that it's worse in the US. I guess I don't feel like a personal need to unpack and rank it, but I think we all do kind of normalize and learn to live with some of the worst instincts of our communities. At the same time, like I was saying, we do actually see some very similar stories. I did a country visit to Belgium maybe about a year and a half ago. And, you know, Belgium, it's known for its French fries and great wine and mussels and oysters. You can eat like a king there. And it's also known for its commitment to human rights. And they see themselves very centrally as a human rights proponent. The EU, the seat of the EU is in Brussels. And there's a real belief that human rights is core to the Belgian mentality. And yet, people of African descent were able to tell us in every single city we visited about their children being systematically diverted away from university-bound mainstream education towards vocational education. We heard from people with graduate degrees and university degrees that they were working as laborers because they would go to the job center. I mean, Belgium is not like the US. There's a tremendous social safety net. They would go for job placement and they would be told by counselors, well, you don't look like the face of Belgium, so we can't place you in a company with a public-facing role. And so although none of this is legal, you saw people with very small amounts of power perpetuating their own perceptions of what it meant to be Belgian, what it meant to be a citizen, what it meant to be valuable. And yeah, that's also something we see other places as well, right? We see this in the United States actually quite a lot. We have been able to measure the racial disparities and the racialized ways in which we evaluate and value children. It's hard to find an elite space where you can look around and see meaningful racial diversity. And so that kind of constant negotiation with who we say we are, our values, and who we sometimes choose to be, that's a space that people like to think of as somehow defined by their local community, or maybe even defined by their country. And yet, what we often see is this exact same issues popping up. I mean, obviously differently. I was in Peru in February. It's a very different, much poorer context, but the exact same issues are happening again, right? So what I find is that you know, in the US, we're very resistant to looking internationally as having relevant authority for us or having relevant lessons for us. And other countries often are as well. And yet, specifically with things like anti-Black racism, white supremacy, these are spaces that actually, the fact that they manifest so consistently country to country does tell us an important lesson. And to me, I'm constantly trying to help people's understanding of racism, understanding of what racism is, particularly when we're talking about the kind of historical racism that has really defined the Black experience. I'm constantly trying to help draw these international connections, but certainly in the US, we're very resistant to it, and not just individuals, even like judges, right? It's very difficult for people in America to really see something outside the US as authoritative. And it's a limitation because it does actually suggest that our commitments to anti-racism are limited by the blinders that we put on ourselves. That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, I mean, there was a tremendous amount of content there that I think really explains a lot of that perspective, right, from both sides, from the US and at the US. Now, the US really views itself as a multicultural, multiracial society, and maybe drawing some of that thought that, well, you know, we know what we're doing, you know, we don't need lessons from others. Do you see any differences in those societies that have been have identified themselves, quote unquote, as multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and those that are less so, or have just been transitioning in recent decades toward that? Do you see a difference in how they address race and social justice in their context?
I think that's a really great question. I'm gonna apologize. There's like a little construction happening right next to me. Um, uh, I think what we see that's different in the US is the multicultural context here, also in the UK, to be honest, has really driven the urgency of collecting data, of seeking to measure the way different groups of people experience things like their human rights, experience access to core elements of their human rights, including, I think, as you know, we don't talk about this much in the US, but their right to education, their right to health, right? Things that can be actually measured by how social institutions function. What I find is, I don't know I'm just not gonna say it very politically. What I find is there's less delusion as to the persistence of racism in spaces that are multicultural, because some people at least have really confronted hypocrisy, right? They've confronted the fact that very smart people who look like me may struggle to get the same job or the same apartment that somebody else who is white does not struggle to get. And right, the ways in which I'm able to confront and articulate the racism I experience is not something that can be explained away. Whereas if you're in like Poland, for example, and there's 5,000 Black people in the whole country, a lot of the issues around racism that may exist often get shunted over to another topic. Lately in Europe, a lot of racism issues get redefined as migration issues, as issues to do with people coming from Africa, either fleeing war or looking for economic opportunity, and maybe not so welcome in certain countries. But for example, just to go back to Belgium for a second, in our Belgian country visit, a country that was a huge colonizer. I think you guys probably know Congo. Not only did it colonize several countries in Africa, but Congo was the personal colony of King Leopold. And somewhere between 17 and 25 million people seem to have been killed in just the colonizing process. And so that legacy, right? If you go to Belgium right now, they'll tell you, well, the Black people, they don't speak the language, they don't learn the language, especially, in Flanders where people speak Dutch or Flemish, right? They may not, they're migrants, they don't really fit in. But, because you have this long period of colonization, you have people who are third generation in Belgium. Their children, the Belgium doesn't keep data, right? So at the third generation, you disappear because you're born in Belgium and your parents were born in Belgium. And that's the level of data they keep. And that's actually how we get a lot of race data in countries that refuse to keep data disaggregated by race. So those people are no longer visible in the data, but you have kids who are third generation Belgians, but they're people of African descent, they're Black, they speak the language perfectly, they're fully integrated into the culture, and yet there's a constant insistence that, they're not being pushed away from university-bound education, they're not being harshly treated, they're not given jobs because of us, because of how we view Black people. It's actually because of them, because they don't speak the language. But then they speak the language, they write. And so it can be really difficult, I found, especially for more homogeneous countries, to really confront the ways in which their assumptions about people of African descent operate. I think the corollary to that, and I know this is a long answer, but I think the corollary to that is how invested we all are in the narratives that really support the valor and the heroism of our families, right? If you're Belgian, your grandfather could have been in Congo as a colonizer. Your grandfather, who you may see as a hero and an explorer, may have also been a rapist and a murderer and a person who committed massive atrocities in order to bring economic wealth to Belgium. And of course, Belgium is a very wealthy country. That's a little bit true here in the US as well, right? Like, you don't have to go that far back to find atrocity in some of our families. And you can either confront that, right? And I'm a big fan of truth telling. I feel like, let's look at our truths in their complexity, the good and the bad, and then we can move forward with the commitments to each other that we want. Or you can say, no, my grandfather was a hero. My grandfather tamed the savages. My grandfather brought civilization to Africa. And so that space to really renegotiate what colonialism meant, the atrocities in that space, the massive dehumanization. They used to have human zoos in Belgium. They would import Black Africans to stand around and like live their lives, and it would be a zoo that people would visit. These spaces, are characterized by people's mindsets that are very unwilling to sort of renegotiate real beliefs about who they are. And that's maybe a little different from the US, because at least in the US, we're very individualistic. But for some people, their family name really is so central that to even renegotiate what it meant to be a colonizer or to be an enslaver implicates people's personal identities. And I think that's another reason we really see the perception of racist belief and racist action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about what you said about family history and the deep-rooted role of these stories and how whole families and generations are tied to that, really, I think, highlights a lot of that resistance that one can see to.
It's personal. That's the thing we forget. These are very personal spaces, right? The stories you're told as a child. And so on some level, if we can't renegotiate that, how do we actually get to a space where we can see people as people?
So, I mean, you raised the perfect question there. How do we get to that space? How does the work of the UN system address this? It sounds so massive, so diverse, so challenging. I know for students who might be participating, some might be in our core courses now, looking at some of these issues, addressing social justice, right? Peace and social justice, discussing such topics and solutions as truth and reconciliation commissions. I wonder what the UN is doing now in terms of its activity to really engage and drive some change in this area.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. And I think your question also hits on some of the biggest challenges, right? Huge bureaucracy, and then really different opinions within that space about what it looks like. And then the UN, unlike most US entities, is consensus-based. And so you spend a lot of time really trying to build consensus rather than, for those of you reading, de Tocqueville, rather than the tyranny of a majority that really just requires, 51% in order to push your agenda through. It's interesting. So in this moment, I think it is a little useful to talk about history, right? People of African descent, Black folk, have sought redress from the UN from the beginning. There was this idea at the beginning of the UN, like the UN, obviously came to be after World War II. Eleanor Roosevelt was massively instrumental, and we think of her as this huge human rights hero, and she was. At the same time, there was a concern that the UN would provide legal redress for American Negroes, right? That ultimately they could use it and use human rights to somehow unravel the legalized system of Jim Crow that existed at the time of the UN's founding. And in fact, that was attempted. The NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois, who probably as the author of The Souls of Black Folk and one of the sort of early amazing sociologists and thought leaders, they brought a petition early on asking for the human rights of Black Americans to be taken up by the UN. Eleanor Roosevelt sat on the board of the NAACP at the time, and yet helped push that aside and just not deal with it. Again, another petition was brought by the National Negro Congress. This is all in the 40s. And then Malcolm X in the 60s petitioned the African nations, just like I was telling you, there are these geographical groups. So the Africa group is one group. They often work as a block to bring forth the situation of civil rights of Black people in the US. And in every one of these spaces, the UN kind of punted. They said, we don't have enough data, or they just disregarded it. Or the Africa group was persuaded by the US and others not to bring that petition forward in the 60s. So what happened this year, and this is why I'm giving you the history, because what happened this year is disappointing, but it is actually a step forward if you're going to look at a very long linear trajectory of 60 years and ask yourself if you're satisfied, is after the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, the Africa group again asked for the UN to have an urgent debate on systemic racism and racism by law enforcement against people of African descent. And in fact, they asked for what's called a commission on inquiry, which is one of the strongest tools available in the human rights toolkit. For those of you studying international law, you may already know we don't enforce international law like we enforce domestic law. International law is enforced things like respect and recognition and reciprocity. International law relies on our standing in the diplomatic community and our own interests in protecting our reputations. But the Commission on Inquiry is sort of an investigative body. And there was a debate in the Human Rights Council as to what could be done, what could be said, and how we could investigate, how we could find facts around this concept that we were seeing so many extrajudicial unlawful killings of Black people, particularly in the US, but not just in the US. And so this urgent debate took place in June, and we were involved in it, some of the other special procedures, and then member states. And you saw member states of the UN, and maybe it's worth a watch if this is sort of your jam. You saw members of states of the UN saying Black Lives Matter, right? I'm not sure I ever thought I'd hear that. And you saw this tremendous commitment, and you know, some states were talking about our reports and how they were now going to commit to putting in recommendations that we had made. We go from country to country, we make recommendations. And so we saw that conversation. The US, if you guys are following the UN, has actually withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. The US withdrew from the Human Rights Council a few years ago and doesn't sit in that body anymore. But what's actually super interesting is that in this urgent debate over whether a commission on inquiry should be convened to investigate the US actually played this massive role behind the scenes. And what we heard a few times was that the Africa group was under tremendous pressure to water down the eventual resolution that would come out of the urgent debate. The US does not sit on that floor. The US did not make a statement. I never spoke to anyone from the diplomatic community in the US, and yet the United States, Australia, the Western European countries, some of the South American countries, operated together to really ensure the language, any operational language, was really pushed down. So the Commission of Inquiry was off the table by maybe the first minute. And then even the idea of doing a fact-finding report or establishing facts, there's lots of like fancy language you use in the UN to try to get things resourced and get things funded, but you have to have like operational language. This was pushed out. The United States was deleted as the focus, that one of the main targets of potential misconduct. And it was considered in civil society, you know, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these non-governmental organizations, sort of the last fight that they fought very hard for was to keep the name of George Floyd in the resolution. So that was achieved, but the US was taken out. All these other things were taken out sequentially. Even though George Floyd's brother spoke very powerfully in front of this space, even though a lot of us did. But the idea was that they wanted a consensus resolution, and you know, the Africa group was under a lot of pressure. And when I say pressure, I think you know what that means, to step into line. So a resolution was passed. The resolution actually has really amazing language in it, but it's not as operational as we would have liked. And so I think it really harkens to the meat of your point, Diana, which is that you do actually see this incredible potential in UN spaces. And sometimes, I mean, the debate in and of itself, I'm not sure, you know, I'm in my late 40s. I'm not sure I really ever thought to see a debate on systemic racism, not even just like, you know, someone's using racial slurs and painting them on the UN door, but systemic racism against people of African descent. I'm not sure I thought I would see that in my lifetime. And yet I'm very dissatisfied with an outcome that didn't fully embody the commitments and the work people put in to that space. At the same time, we do have a resolution, and it gives us something. But that is kind of how the UN is. It's a massive bureaucracy. We talk about human rights, but human rights is never pure in that space, and that's a frustrating space also, right? Like, you'll never separate human rights from development, from security, from other individual national interests. And that's the nature of a political body. So we navigate, we negotiate, but there is something very hopeful about it also, because you do actually see things happen that you don't expect to happen. You do see people's commitments, and you do see internal champions really pushing things forward. And, you know, I think you know, you said a lot of these students and a lot of the people on this call are really social justice focused. I think a lot of us have learned at this point that you fight in every space possible. And when you can't do it anymore and you get burned out, you go fight in a different space, right? You just change the context. And so social justice is about how we mobilize our resources, how we mobilize even our personal commitments to really increase justice.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that little window into the power, behind the scenes power mechanisms at the UN, which I think is really interesting to think about, because so much of that happens behind the scenes. It's not necessarily on the floor of the chamber.
It's so interesting, right? Because politically, you're seeing a lot on the news about how disrespected the US is in the international context, and the fact that these world leaders don't appreciate our president. And yet, it was interesting how quickly they all closed ranks when they didn't want to be held accountable for systemic racism. So I found that to be a fascinating commentary on our current political moment as well, where people of different political positions may say, "Oh, we have to do this, we have to do that. The internationals are saying this about us." We seem to be able to move our agenda forward irrespective of who leads the country. Not that that's, you know, I obviously have a political perspective, and I'm sure you guys can figure out what it is, but it was very interesting, particularly given our political leadership and what's been said in the media about the impact of that on our international standing.
Yeah. So given all this, what can be done? And when we think about the obstacles that are there to making progress, introducing change, what can be done in the near term, and what can local communities do? What can individuals do? Have you seen models that have been really effective and implemented here in the US or around the world?
I think that's the question, right? That's exactly the question we need to focus on. To me, when you're talking about things like truth and reconciliation, there is a role for truth telling and for really embracing truth in its complexity, in its ugliness even. To me, when we're talking about systemic racism, you have to actually get past the fact that a solid percentage of people are going to tell you it doesn't exist. I can offer up where I'm an attorney, I've been practicing for all this time. I go into court and I'm wearing a suit, I'm carrying a computer, I'm doing all the things my client, who's a criminal defendant, cannot do. And yet I am often mistaken for the criminal defendant in that context, right? How is it that the color of my skin so overwhelms all the indicia of me as a lawyer? I'm in a fancy suit, I have a briefcase, I have a computer, I walk into the well of the courtroom, I put my name on the record. And yet the judge, when he's like, counsel approaches them, I'm not you. Right. So these spaces, which are actually common, right? People are talking about them. There was a recent report in New York that this is an experience that a lot of Black people are having. Right, like when called out on it, people say, oh, well, it was a mistake, it wasn't, right? But that is actually, right? No one's saying you're going to go out with a pitchfork, but at the same time, that is an act of systemic racism. That is how the system operates, to assume that people look like me hold one role and people who look like you might hold a different role. And on some level, really interrogating, looking at our mindset, looking at the assumptions that govern our day, why that is, looking at the ways in which we negotiate the world. There's a writer, Claudia Rankine, who wrote this great poem, Citizen, and one of her essays, she says, how is it that we've created such a culture of sameness that we have no understanding of how people whose skin is brown or black live in our same communities? And so I think on some level, we really do have to unpack our own mindsets that do drive and perpetuate and license systemic racism, even the ways in which we may mobilize our own privilege, right? You guys are going to go out and get jobs. Some of you may have an easier time than others, and you're going to use that, right? And like that space is actually a perpetrator of the problem we're trying to solve. And so I think we have to look at our mindsets. We have to have those conversations in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces. And in my view, the more we're able to really amplify how these problems play out locally, how these problems look locally, and that's what I do in my UN work. I go to country or space to space, and I say, this is how systemic racism looks. Then we can actually say, okay, here's how we're going to target this. Here's how we're, if teachers are sending all the kids who are brown and black to vocational education, maybe the thing we need to do is put in another review process, or put in something that's more objective to really think through what power teachers are exerting in this space. But on some level, you need, either through data or through conversation, or ideally both, to really sort of uplift and fully understand the problem, and then just start taking it piece by piece by piece, because these problems intersect, right? If you're being pushed away from university education, then maybe you get yourself into university, but in that space you're very rare. Are you going to get a job? I mean, these problems kind of have a domino effect, and so our commitments need to be in all the spaces. I mean, we need to recognize this is systemic racism. Just as it has defined our modern global economy, it also is embedded, right? In order to create a rationalization for atrocity, we had to embed it in all the different areas of our communities. And so we have to dismantle it in all those places as well.
Gosh, I could go on now for another hour, but I'm looking at the time, and I want to give our audience an opportunity really to ask their questions, and I'm sure there's quite a few. So I'll hand it over to Ashley, who can moderate some of the questions for us.
Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in. I had one request. A professor had asked if he could speak with you and ask his question directly. Let me unmute him. John, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak, because I wanted to thank you personally. I'm here with my ethics class, and we added a component. They're all waving. They're all attending in here. And I added a section thinking about racial justice to the end of this course for the first time as a result of Black Lives Matter and what was going on more generally. So I was very appreciative to hear you talk about what can we do, because the focus of our class is how does one live, and how does one live well with those around us. I would also say I appreciate the point about having to tell stories. I'm coming to realize I probably had a racist uncle cop who did some pretty horrible things. I'm hoping he didn't kill anybody, but that's the truth, right? He probably was pretty awful. So these are the kinds of things I completely agree with you we need to be speaking about. My question is, 20 years after Durban, the United States is still resisting any kind of engagement from the outside about interrogating our problem with race. And it seems to me it's perhaps more than simply not like a parochialism that doesn't like to have the outside look at us. And I'm wondering if you could comment more on what's the root cause of why the United States government as a political entity seems to resist this, and perhaps not only under, Presidents Bush and Trump. Thank you very much.
Oop, there you
Sorry
go.
about
There you
that.
go. You're on.
Yeah.
You're
Sorry.
muted.
I was moving to a charger, and then of course I didn't realize I was on mute. I'm a lawyer. If you look back to the beginning of our country, we've always been very driven by economic arguments and economic necessity arguments. We haven't been driven by public policy arguments. Right? And so there is this space where I think on some level there is the social and personal difficulty of looking at ourselves as racist, of acknowledging that we've been educated into white supremacy. And that is something that I think is a relic of the kind of racism people were fighting, for the first few hundred years of our country. Today, you'll see a lot of people who would never admit that racism is within their mindset, even though I'm a Black woman. I went to fancy schools. I was absolutely educated into white supremacy, and I do absolutely spend time checking that. But that, there's research, there's psychological research that says this is psychologically devastating for people to even acknowledge their own complicity in white supremacy, their own privilege, and we've seen that. We've seen how challenging that can be. At the same time, I think the thing you're doing is the thing, right? I think as a racial justice person, it's been hard for me to watch how many people for the first time are thinking about racial justice in these different spaces, but it's also very hopeful. And when I give credit, some of the credit I give is to your students, right? Some of the credit I give is to people on this call, right? Who, people my age and older, we've had a lot of very complicated and sometimes negative things to say about millennials. Lawyers like me often talk about the fact that millennials don't like track changes and they cry at work, and why can't they just work, in the evening? Why is it that it's such a different ethic? But what we've seen this year, which is a revolution, is that millennials and younger are disinclined to sit with the routine discomforts of systemic racism, of misogyny, right? That ultimately the same thing that might make it complicated for me to use a red pen on a legal brief has also informed a revolution all over the world where people your age have said, even if this is the way things are done, this is not a system I plan to opt into and accept uncritically. And that is changed conversations. We started conversations about Me Too. We started conversations about racism that have not happened in my entire professional life. Your class, right, has been influenced by the activism and the commitments and the outrage of people your students' age. And I think there is something really there. I think I owe a huge debt to people, teenagers and above, who've really redefined what it means to be a citizen, to be a person who's committed to justice, and who've really demanded global attention in that space. But I think, as you're saying, all the different spaces that we sort of knit this stuff together, all the different spaces we have these conversations and truth tell, a lot of this has to do with just this basic core disinclination by young folk to just be complicit, to quietly go along, to say, yeah, this is the world we're going to inherit, and we're going to go along with that. So I don't know how well that answers your question, but or your comment, but I appreciated your comment a lot.
Thank you, John. Another question in the chat: What do you believe is the future of race relations in the U.S., and what can those of us living in Black experience do to improve our likelihood?
Yeah, our likelihood of success, or likelihood of racial justice. Maybe I'll just construe it how I construe it. I think to be Black in America is to define your identity in struggle. I think, I'm not gonna be able to quote the person, right? But I think we're not always gonna live to see the kind of justice or the kind of happiness or the kind of ease that we want. And maybe our children won't either. But I think on some level, for me as a Black woman, getting up every day and defining my commitments, my joy, my resilience, and my time in terms of struggle is something that that offers me a way to survive and a way to feel happiness and a way to feel relevant in a world that often feels hopeless. This was not an easy summer for any of us of every race, but especially Black folk. I personally felt like I was reeling every 5 minutes. And that space of understanding that we have been in struggle for as long as we've been in this country, we will continue to be in struggle until we really see a meaningful renegotiation of our national identity to really embrace and add complexity so that people of many different identities and people of many different histories really are seen as core elements of the American experience. Until that's done, struggle will continue. And so I think in the Black community, you've seen real definitions in that direction. You see the Black church, you see performance spaces, right? You see artistry that really situates performance and music and joy and art also within struggle, and understands that it's not just beautiful, it's also necessary, so that this is how we keep breathing. And for me, this is how I keep breathing. It's really funny. I know some people say something different from this. I know some people are like, I can't read all the news. I need to stop. I'm definitely the person who likes to just drown in racial injustice. I like to know all the things, and it makes me feel lighter. It makes me feel free because I feel like I'm grappling with a reality, and then I can sleep at night knowing that I've done that. And I think it's very fair for people who do it differently, who say, I have a lot of family who say, you know what, I need to be in a lighter space. Too much of my life is negotiating heavy things. But in all of these spaces, right, we see our identities, we see our commitments as really grounded in a struggle that not only will we not necessarily cross the finish line, the struggle itself is going to change, right? If you guys are students of sort of legal history, right? Thurgood Marshall created a very linear strategy, the road to Brown, we call it the road to Brown, right? The road to Brown versus Board of Education, that started with all sorts of legal cases to dismantle barriers to having Black people in public, be able to access public accommodations. And eventually we got to school, where we got to say separate but equal is not separate but equal. That linear strategy of legal reform that dismantled the legalized racism, it's not a strategy that necessarily works today, right? The struggle has to shift. We have to change our strategies. We have to change our understandings. That is why I'm like very hyped and very enthralled with this young generation, because even more vociferously and without the experience and the devastations that we've all experienced feeling racism at work, sexual harassment at work, even without necessarily experiencing all of that, this generation has said, we want strategies that work, and we're disinclined to engage in the piecemeal nonsense that has led you to accept mediocrity as adequacy. Obviously, this generation may grow, you may change, you may actually start accepting more things. I get all of that. But the disinclination to retreat to the mediocre is a really beautiful thing. And it's something that this generation has brought forward that is new, that is different, and that is revolutionary. And people my age are looking to you and looking at you as just unexpected and really beautiful leaders. That was a long answer, sorry about
No, that was great, thank you. And the last question we have for today, what are your thoughts on the protests that turn into riots caused by the police firing tear gas and rubber bullets into the crowd?
You know, I believe in protest. When we talk about democracy, if you guys are like political theorists, democracy is a political system that's based on discourse. You can't have democracy without dissent. You can't have democracy without protest, right? Democracy requires us to be rigorously engaged with each other to hopefully come to a space of some consensus. I don't think, you're never gonna hear me say, I don't know, I have yet to see a protest where anyone was forced to fire rubber bullets, where anyone was forced to use tear gas. And in fact, what we've seen, and certainly I was here in New York during a lot of it, what we've seen is often a hasty retreat to the use of violence, the use of excessive force, the use of tear gas against peaceful protesters. Protest has a trajectory. People come together, they feel anger, they protest. Typically, the trajectory is then they go home, right? Or in a couple of weeks they go home, and they seek to make inroads into the ways that their frustration can be exacted and can be dealt with in policy or can be dealt with in law. So to me, to add tear gas to that is to delegitimize and to try to frustrate protest, when in fact protest is necessary to the democracy we say we want. Protest is necessary to the level of critical thinking we say we want. At the same time, right, we've definitely seen things like looting and rioting, and there's some really great analyses out there that talk about maybe we don't need to look at rioting and looting as property destruction uniformly negative. I'm not going to sort of cite all this now, and I know we're running out of time, but one of the things people said is you wouldn't have a hip hop industry in the Bronx were it not for the looting that took place that allowed people to get materials they could never access from studios, and that created this massive hip hop industry in the 80s. I'm not justifying any kind of violence. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a violent person. You're not even going to find me agreeing with anybody that they need a gun, right? I'm a lawyer from New York. At the same time, the analyses that really ask us to conceptualize our criticisms and our concerns about looting and different kinds of protests, including property damage, it's worth it to look at those analyses in a robust and comprehensive way, including the position and even the political positions of some people who may engage in that behavior. It's not black and white. It's not simple. It can't be answered in 30 seconds, but there's some amazing analysis out there, and I think it's worth watching and reading.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think we're just about out of time, so I wanted to extend our thanks from Fairleigh Dickinson University and from the Office of Global Learning for a tremendous event, and really a lot for us to take away and think about. I think we could certainly go on with this for at least another hour at minimum. There's a lot of real interest and desire to learn, to understand, and to make change. So I think you've helped us quite a bit in that regard. So thank you very much.
No, well, thank you. It's really a privilege to be able to join you today, and good luck with all you do.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.